Hey everyone, we are reading Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, the remarkable true story of the American capitalists who financed the Russian communists. Anthony C. Sutton. Part 4, Chapter 9, Guaranteed Trust goes to Russia. Soviet government desired Guarantee Trust Company to become fiscal agent in United States for all Soviet operations. It contemplates American purchase Isti Bank with a view to complete linking of Soviet fortunes with American financial interests. William H. Coombs, reporting to the U.S. Embassy in London, June 1, 1920. Excuse me. In 1918, the Soviets faced a bewildering array of internal and external problems. They occupied a mere fraction of Russia. To subdue the remainder, they needed foreign arms, imported food, outside financial support, diplomatic recognition, and above all, foreign trade. To gain diplomatic recognition and foreign trade, the Soviets first needed representation abroad. And representation in turn required financing through gold or foreign currencies. As we have already seen, the first step was to establish the Soviet Bureau in New York under Ludwig Martens. At the same time, efforts were made to transfer funds to the United States and Europe for purchases of needed goods. Then influence was exerted into the United States to gain recognition or to obtain the export licenses needed to ship goods to Russia. That's better. New York bankers and lawyers provided significant, in some cases critical, assistance for each of the tasks. When Professor George V. Lomonosov, the Russian technical expert in the Soviet Bureau, needed to transfer funds from the chief Soviet agent in Scandinavia, a prominent Wall Street attorney came to his assistance, using official State Department channels and the acting Secretary of State as an intermediary. When gold had to be transferred to the United States, it was American International Corporation, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and Guarantee Trust that requested the facilities and used their influence in Washington to smooth the way. And when it came to recognition, we find American firms pleading with Congress and with the public to endorse the Soviet regime. Lest the reader should deduce too hastily from these assertions that Wall Street was indeed tinged with red, or that red flags were flying in the street, see frontispiece. We also, in a later chapter, present evidence that J.P. Morgan firm financed Admiral Kolchak in Siberia. Alexander Kolchak was fighting the Bolsheviks to install his own brand of authoritarian rule. The firm also contributed to anti-communist United Americans organization. Wall Street comes to the aid of Professor Lomonosov. The case of Professor Lomonosov is a detailed case history of Wall Street assistance to the early Soviet regime. In late 1918, George V. Lomonosov, member of the Soviet Bureau in New York, and later first Soviet Commissar of Railroads, found himself stranded in the United States without funds. At this time, Bolshevik funds were denied entry into the United States. Indeed, there were no official recognition of the regime at all. Lomonosov was the subject of a letter of October 24th, 1918, from the U.S. Department of Justice to the Department of State. The letter referred to Lomonosov's Bolshevik attributes and pro-Bolshevik speeches. The investigator concluded, Professor Lomonosov is not a Bolshevik, although his speeches constitute unequivocal support for the Bolshevik cause. Yet, Lomonosov was able to pull strings at the highest levels of the administration to have $25,000 transferred from the Soviet Union through a Soviet espionage agent in Scandinavia. who was himself later to become confidential assistant to Reeve Schley, a vice president of Chase Bank. All this with the assistance of a member of a prominent Wall Street firm of attorneys. This section is from the U.S. Senate Russian Propaganda Hearings Before a Subcommittee of the Committee on Foreign Relations, 66th Congress, Second Session, 1920. Excuse me. The evidence is presented in detail because the details themselves point up the close relationship between certain interests that up to now have been thought of as bitter enemies. The first indication of Lomonosov's problem is a letter dated January 7, 1919, from Thomas L. Chadbourne of Chadbourne, Babbitt, and Wall of 14 Wall Street. Same address as William Boyce Thompson's, to Frank Polk, Acting Secretary of State. Note the friendly salutation and casual reference to Michael Grusenberg, alias Alexander Gumberg, chief Soviet agent in Scandinavia and later Lomonosov's assistant. Dear Frank, you were kind enough to say that if I could inform you of the status of the $25,000 item of personal funds belonging to Mr. and Miss Lomonosov, you would set in motion the machinery necessary to obtain it from them. I've communicated with Mr. Lomonosov with respect to it, and he tells me that Mr. Michael Grusenberg, who went to Russia for Mr. Lomonosov prior to the difficulties between Ambassador Bakhmatiev and Mr. Lomonosov, transmitted the information to him respecting this money through 3 Russians, who recently arrived from Sweden, and Mr. Lomonosov believes that the money is held at the Russian embassy in Stockholm. Milmixnad Gaten 37. If inquiry from the State Department should develop this to be not the place where the money is on deposit, then the Russian embassy in Stockholm can give the exact address of Mr. Grusenberg, who can give the proper information respecting it. Mr. Lomonosov does not receive letters from Mr. Grusenberg, although he is informed that they have been written. Nor have any of his letters to Mr. Grusenberg been delivered, he is also informed. For this reason, it is impossible to be more definite than I have been, but I hope something can be done to relieve his and his wife's embarrassment for lack of funds, and it only needs a little help to secure this money, which belongs to them, to aid them on this side of the water. Thanking you in advance for anything you can do, I beg to remain, as ever, yours sincerely, Thomas L. Chadbourne. In 1919, at the time this letter was written, Chadbourne was a $1 a year man in Washington, counsel and director of the U.S. War Trade Board, and a director of the U.S. Russian Bureau, Inc., an official front company of the U.S. government. Previously in 1915, Chadbourne organized Midvale Steel and Ordnance to take advantage of war business. In 1916, he became chairman of the Democratic Finance Committee and later director of Wright Aeronautical and of Mack Trucks. The reason Lomonosov was not receiving letters from Grusenberg is that they were, in all probability, being intercepted by one of several governments taking a keen interest in the latter's activities. On January 11, 1919, Frank Polk cabled the American legation in Stockholm. Quote, "Department is in receipt of information that $25,000 personal funds of, kindly inquire of the Russian legation informally and personally if such funds are held thus. Ascertain, if not, address of Mr. Michael Grusenberg, reported to be in possession of information on the subject. Department not concerned officially, merely undertaking inquiries on behalf of a former Russian official in this country. Polk, acting." Polk appears in this letter to be unaware of Lomonosov's Bolshevik connections and refers to him as a, quote, "a former Russian official in this country," unquote. But that as it may, within 3 days, Polk received a reply from Morris. Oh, my goodness. at the U.S. legation in Stockholm. January 14th, 3 p.m., 3492, your January 12th, 3 p.m., number 1443. Sum of $25,000 of former President of Russian Commission of Ways of Communication in the United States not known to Russian legation. Neither can address of Mr. Michael Grusenberg be obtained. Morris. Apparently, Frank Polk then wrote to Chadbourne. The letter is not included in the source, and indicated that state could find neither Lomonosov nor Michael Grusenberg. Chadbourne replied on January 21st, 1919. Quote, Dear Frank, many thanks for your letter of January 17th. I understand that there are two Russian legations in Sweden, one being the Soviet and the other the Kerensky, and I presume your inquiry was directed to the Soviet legation as that was the address I gave you in my letter, namely Milmixnad Gaten, 37 Stockholm. Michael Grusenberg's address is Holmenkollen Sanitarium, Christiania, Norway, and I think the Soviet legation could find out all about the funds through Grusenberg if they will communicate with him. Thanking you for taking this trouble and assuring you of my deep appreciation, I remain. Sincerely yours, Thomas L. Chadbourne. We should note that a Wall Street lawyer had the address of Grusenberg, chief Bolshevik agent in Scandinavia, at a time when the acting Secretary of State in the U.S. Stockholm legation had no record of the address, nor could the legation track it down. Chadbourne also presumed that the Soviets were the official government of Russia, although that government was not recognized by the United States, and Chadbourne's official government position on the War Trade Board would require him to know that. Frank Polk then cabled the American legation at Christiania, Norway, with the address of Michael Grusenberg. It is not known whether Polk knew he was passing on the address of an espionage agent, but his message was as follows. To American Legation, Christiania, January 25th, 1919. It is reported that Michael Grusenberg is at Holmenkollen Sanitarium. It is possible for you to locate him and inquire if he has any knowledge respecting disposition of $25,000 fund belonging to former President of Russian Mission of Ways of Communication in the United States, Professor Lomonosov, Polk, acting. The U.S. Representative Schmiedman at Christiania knew Grusenberg well. Indeed, the name had figured in reports from Schmiedman to Washington concerning Grusenberg's pro-Soviet activities in Norway. Schmiedman replied, January 29th, 8 p.m., 1543. Important. Your January 25th telegram number 650. Before departing today for Russia, Michael Grusenberg informed our naval attaché that when in Russia some few months ago, he had received, at Lomonosov's request, $25,000 from the Russian Railway Experimental Institute, of which Professor Lomonosov was president. Grusenberg claims that today he cabled attorney for Lomonosov in New York, Morris Hillquit, that he, Grusenberg, is in possession of the money, and before forwarding, it is awaiting further instructions from the United States, requesting in the cablegram that Lomonosov be furnished with living expenses for himself and family by Hillquit pending the receipt of the money. As Minister Morris was traveling to Stockholm on the same train as Grusenberg, the latter stated that he would advise further with Morris in reference to the subject. Schmiederman. The U.S. Minister traveled to Grusenberg to Stockholm, where he received the following cable from Polk. It is reported by legation at Christiania that Michael Grusenberg has for Professor Lomonosov the ... sum of $25,000 received from Russian Railway Experimental Institute. If you can do so without being involved with Bolshevik authorities, the department will be glad for you to facilitate transfer of money to Professor Lomonosov in this country. Kindly reply. Polk, acting. Excuse me. This cable produced results for on February 5th, 1919, Frank Polk wrote to Chadbourne about a dangerous Bolshevik agitator, Grusenberg. My dear Tom, I have a telegram from Christiania indicating that Michael Grusenberg has the $25,000 of Professor Lomonosov and received it from the Russian Railway Experimental Institute, and that he had cabled Morris Hillquit at New York to furnish Professor Lomonosov money for living expenses until the fund in question can be transmitted to him. As Grusenberg has just been deported from Norway as a dangerous Bolshevik agitator, he may have had difficulties in telegraphing from that country. I understand he has now gone to Christiania, and while it is somewhat out of the department's line of action, I shall be glad, if you wish, to see if I shall have Mr. Grusenberg remit the money to Professor Lomonosov from Stockholm, and telegraphing our minister there to find out if that can be done. Very sincerely yours, Frank L. Polk. The telegram from Christiania referred to in Polk's letter reads as follows. February 3rd, 6 p.m., 3580. Important. Referring departments January 12th, number 1443, $10,000 has now been deposited in Stockholm to my order to be forwarded to Professor Lomonosov by Michael Grusenberg, one of the former representatives of the Bolsheviks in Norway. I informed him before accepting this money that I would communicate with you and inquire if it is your wish that this money be forwarded to Lomonosov. Therefore, I request instructions as to my course of action. Morris. Subsequently, Morris, in Stockholm, requested disposal instructions for a $10,000 draft deposited in a Stockholm bank. His phrase, quote, "This has been my only connection with the affair," unquote, suggests that Morris was aware that the Soviets could, and probably would, claim this as an official expedited monetary transfer, since this action implied approval by the U.S. of such monetary transfers. Up to this time, the Soviets had been required to smuggle money into the United States. 4 p.m., February 12, 3610, routine. With reference to my February 3rd, 6 p.m., number 3580, and your February 8th, 7 p.m., number 1501, it is not clear to me whether it is your wish for me to transfer through you the $10,000 referred to Professor Lomonosov. Being advised by Grusenberg that he had deposited this money to the order of Lomonosov in a Stockholm bank and has advised the bank that this draft could be sent to America through me, provided I so ordered, has been my only connection with the affair. Kindly wire instructions, Morris. Then follows a series of letters on the transfer of the $10,000 from A.B. Nordzig Res Bureau to Thomas L. Chadbourne at 520 Park Avenue, New York City, through the meeting with the State Department. This first letter contains instructions from Polk on the mechanics of the transfer. The second, from Morris to Polk, contains $10,000. The third, from Morris to A.B. Nordzig Res Bureau, requesting a draft. The fourth, in a reply from the bank with a check. And the fifth, in the acknowledgement. Your February 12th, 4 p.m., number 3610. Money be transmitted direct to Thomas L. Chadbourne, 520 Park Avenue, New York City. Polk, Acton. Dispatch number 1600, March 6, 1919. The Honorable the Secretary of State, Washington. Sir, referring to my telegram, number 3610 of February 12th, into the Department's reply, number 1524 of February 19, in regard to the sum of $10,000 for Professor Lomonosov. I have the honor herewith to enclose copy of a letter which I addressed on February 25th to A.B. Norblisk, Res Bureau, the bankers with whom this money was deposited. A copy of the reply of A.B. Nordzig Res Bureau, dated February 26th, and a copy of my letter to the A.B. Nordzig Res Bureau, dated February 27th. It will be seen from this correspondence that the bank was desirous of having this money forwarded to Professor Lomonosov. I explained to them, however, as will be seen from my letter of February 27th, that I had received authorization to forward it directly to Mr. Thomas L. Chadbourne, 520 Park Avenue, New York City. I also enclose herewith an envelope addressed to Mr. Chadbourne, in which I enclosed a letter to him, together with a check of the National City Bank of New York for $10,000. I have the honor to be, sir, your obedient servant, Ira N. Morris. A.B. Nordisk, Res Bureau. Number 4 Vestra, Tradsgardsgaten, Stockholm. Gentlemen, upon receiving your letter on January 30th stating that you had received $10,000 to be paid to Professor Lomonosov upon my request, I immediately telegraphed to my government asking whether they wished this money forwarded to Professor Lomonosov. I have today received a reply authorizing me to forward the money direct to Mr. Thomas L. Chadbourne, payable to Professor Lomonosov. I shall be glad to forward it as instructed by my government. I am, gentlemen, very truly yours, Ira N. Morris. Mr. I. N. Morris, American Minister, Stockholm. Dear Sir, we beg to acknowledge the receipt of your favor of yesterday regarding payment of $10,000 to Professor G.V. Lomonosov, and we hereby have the pleasure to enclose a check for said amount to the order of Professor G.V. Lomonosov, which we understand that you are kindly forwarding to this gentleman. We shall be glad to have your receipt for same, and beg to remain. Yours respectfully, A.B. Nordisk, Res Bureau. A.B. Nordisk, Res Bureau, Stockholm. Gentlemen, I beg to acknowledge receipt of your letter of February 26th, including a check for $10,000 payable to blah, blah, blah. As I advised you in my letter of February 5th, I have been authorized to forward this letter to Chadbourne, and I shall forward it to gentlemen within the next few days. Ira Morris. Then follow an internal State Department memorandum and Chadbourne's acknowledgement. Mr. Phillips to Mr. Chadbourne, April 3rd, 1919. Sir, referring to previous correspondence regarding remittance of $10,000 from A.B. Nordisk, Res Bureau to Professor G.V. Lomonosov, which you requested to be transmitted through the American Legation at Stockholm. The department informs you that it is in receipt of a dispatch from the American Minister at Stockholm dated March 6, 1919, covering the enclosed letter addressed to you, together with a check for the amount referred to, drawn to the order to Professor Lomonosov. I am, sir, your obedient servant, William Phillips, Acting Secretary of State. Enclosure. Sealed letter addressed to Mr. Thomas L. Chadbourne, enclosed with 1600 from Sweden. Reply of Mr. Chadbourne, April 5th, 1919. Sir, I beg to acknowledge receipt of your letter on April 3rd, enclosing a letter addressed to me, containing check for $10,000 drawn to the order of Professor Lomonosov, which check I have today delivered. I beg to remain with great respect. Very truly yours, Thomas L. Chadbourne. Subsequently, the Stockholm legation inquired concerning Lomonosov's address in the United States and was informed by the State Department that, quote, as far as the department is aware, Professor George V. Lomonosov can be reached in care of Mr. Thomas L. Chadbourne, 520 Park Avenue, New York City. It is evident that the State Department, for the reason either of personal friendship between Polk and Chadbourne or of political influence, felt it had to go along and act as a bagman for a Bolshevik agent just ejected from Norway. But why would a prestigious establishment law firm be so intimately interested in the health and welfare of a Bolshevik emissary? Perhaps a contemporary State Department report gives the clue. Martins, the Bolshevik representative, and Professor Lomonosov are banking on the fact that Bullitt and his party will make a favorable report to the mission and the president regarding conditions in Soviet Russia, and that on the basis of this report, the government on the United States will favor dealing with the Soviet government as proposed by Martins, March 29, 1919. The stage is set for commercial exploitations of Russia. It was commercial exploitation of Russia that excited Wall Street, and Wall Street had lost no time in preparing its program. On May 1st, 1918, an auspicious date for Red revolutionaries, the American League to Aid and Cooperate with Russia was established, and its program approved in a conference held in the Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. The officers and executive committee of the League represented some superficially dissimilar factions. Its president was Dr. Frank J. Goodnow, president of Johns Hopkins University. Vice presidents were the ever-active William Boyce Thompson, Oscar S. Strauss, James Duncan, and Frederick C. Howe, who wrote Confessions of a Monopolist, the rule book by which monopolists could control society. The treasurer was George P. Wayland and vice president of Vacuum Oil Company. Congress was represented by Senator William Edgar Borah and Senator John Sharp Williams of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator William N. Calder, and Senator Robert L. Owen, chairman of the Banking and Currency Committee. House members were Henry R. Cooper and Henry D. Flood, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. American business was represented by Henry Ford, Charles A. Coffin, chairman of the board of General Electric Company, and M. A. Uden, the foreign manager of General Electric. George P. Wayland represented Vacuum Oil Company, and Daniel Willard was president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The more overtly revolutionary element was represented by Miss Raymond Robbins, whose name was later found to be prominent in the Soviet bureau files and in the Lusk committee hearings. Henry L. Slobodin, described as a, quote, prominent patriotic socialist, unquote, and Lincoln Steffens, a domestic communist of note. In other words, this was a hybrid executive committee. They represented domestic revolutionary elements, the Congress of the United States, and financial interests prominently involved with Russian affairs. Approved by the executive committee was a program that emphasized the establishment of an official Russian division in the United States government, quote, directed by strong men, unquote. This division would enlist the aid of universities, scientific organizations, and other institutions to study the, quote, Russian question, unquote, would coordinate and unite organizations within the United States, quote, for the safeguarding of Russia, unquote, would arrange for a, quote, special intelligence committee for the investigation of the Russian matter, unquote, and generally would itself study and investigate what would be deemed to be, quote, Russian question, unquote. The executive committee, when passed a resolution supporting President Woodrow Wilson's message to the Soviet Congress in Moscow, and the League affirmed its own support for the new Soviet Russia. A few weeks later, on May 20th, 1918, Frank J. Goodnow and Herbert A. Carpenter, representing the League, called upon Assistant Secretary of State William Phillips and impressed upon him the necessity for establishing an, quote, official Russian division of the government to coordinate all Russian matters. They asked me, wrote Phillips, whether they should take this matter up with the president, unquote. Phillips reported this directly to the Secretary of State, and on the next day wrote Charles R. Crane in New York City, requesting his views on the American League to aid and cooperate with Russia. Phillips besought Crane, quote, I really want your advice as to how we should treat the League. We do not want to stir up trouble by refusing to cooperate with them. On the other hand, it is a queer committee and I don't quite get it, unquote. In early June, there arrived at the State Department a letter from William Franklin Sands of American International Corporation for Secretary of State Robert Lansing. Sands proposed that the United States appoint an administrator in Russia rather than a commission, and opined that, quote, the suggestion of an allied military force in Russia at the present moment seems to be a very dangerous one, unquote. Sands emphasized the possibility of trade with Russia and that this possibility could be advanced, quote, by a well-chosen administrator enjoying the full confidence of the government, unquote. He indicated that, quote, Mr. Hoover might fit the role. The letter was passed to Phillips by Basil Miles, a former associate of Sands, with the expression, quote, I think the secretary would find it worthwhile to look through, unquote. In early June, the War Trade Board, subordinate to the State Department, passed a resolution in the committee of the board comprising Thomas L. Chadbourne, Professor Lomonosov's contact, Clarence M. Woolley, and John Foster Dulé, submitted a memorandum to the Department of State urging consideration of ways and means to bring about closer and more friendly commercial relations between the United States and Russia, unquote. The board recommended a mission to Russia and reopened the question whether this should result from an invitation from the Soviet government. Then on June 10th, M.A. Udin, foreign manager of General Electric Company, expressed his views on Russia and clearly favored a, quote, constructive plan for the economic assistance, unquote, of Russia. In August 1918, Cyrus M. McCormick of International Harvester wrote to Basil Miles at the State Department and praised the president's program for Russia, which McCormick thought would be, quote, a golden opportunity, unquote. Consequently, we find in mid-1918 a concerted effort by a segment of American business, obviously prepared to open up trade, to take advantage of its own preferred position regarding the Soviets. Germany and the United States struggle for Russian business. In 1918, such assistance to the embryonic Bolshevik regime was justified on the grounds of defeating Germany and inhibiting German exploitation of Russia. This was the argument used by W.B. Thompson and Raymond Robbins in sending Bolshevik revolutionaries and propaganda teams into Germany in 1918. The argument was also employed by Thompson in 1917 when conferring with Prime Minister Lloyd George about obtaining British support for the emerging Bolshevik regime. In June 1918, Ambassador Francis and his staff returned from Russia and urged President Wilson to, quote, to recognize and aid the Soviet government of Russia, unquote. These reports made by the embassy staff to the State Department were leaked to the press and widely printed. Above all, it was claimed that delay in recognizing the Soviet Union would aid Germany, quote, and helps the German plan to foster reaction and counter-revolution, unquote. Exaggerated statistics were cited to support their proposal. For example, that the Soviet government represented 90% of the Russian people, quote, and the other 10% is the former proprietor and governing class. Naturally, they are displeased, unquote. A former American official was quoted saying, quote, if we do nothing, that is, if we just let things drift, we will weaken the Russian-Soviet government, and that plays Germany's game, unquote. So it was recommended that, quote, a commission armed with credit and good business advice could help much, unquote. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the economic situation had been critical, and the inevitability of an embrace with capitalism dawned on the Communist Party and its planners. Lenin crystallized this awareness before the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. Quote, without the assistance of capital, it will be impossible for us to retain proletarian power in an incredibly ruined country in which the peasantry, also ruined, constitutes the overwhelming majority, and, of course, for this assistance, capital will squeeze 100% out of us. This is what we have to understand. Hence, either this type of economic relations or nothing. Then, Leon Trotsky was quoted as saying, quote, what we need here is an organizer like Bernard M. Baruch, unquote. Soviet awareness of its impending economic doom suggests that American and German business was attracted by the opportunity of exploiting the Russian market for needed goods. The Germans, in fact, made an earlier start in 1918. The first deals made by the Soviet Bureau in New York indicate that earlier American financial and moral support of the Bolsheviks was paying off in the form of contracts. The largest order in 1919 through 1920 was contracted to Morris & Co., Chicago meat packers, for 50 million pounds of food products, valued at approximately $10 million. The Morris meatpacking family was related to the Swift family. Helen Swift, later connected with the Abraham Lincoln Center Unity, was married to Edward Morris of the meatpacking firm. He was also the brother of Harold H. Swift, a, quote, major, unquote, in the 1917 Thomson Red Cross mission to Russia. Ludwig Martins was formerly vice president of Weinberg and Posner, located at 120 Broadway, New York City, and this firm was given a $3 million order. Soviet gold in American banks. Gold was the only practical means by which the Soviet Union could pay for its foreign purchases, and the international bankers were quite willing to facilitate Soviet gold shipments. Russian gold exports, primarily imperial gold coins, started in early 1920 to Norway and Sweden. These were transshipped to Holland and Germany for other world destinations, including the United States. In August 1920, a shipment of Russian gold coins was received at the Den Norsk Handelsbank in Norway as a guarantee for payment of 3,000 tons of coal by Niels Juel and Company in the U.S. on behalf of the Soviet government. These coins were transferred to the Norges Bank for safekeeping. The coins were examined and weighed, were found to have been minted before the outbreak of war in 1914, were therefore genuine Imperial Russian coins. Shortly after this initial episode, the Robert Dollar Company of San Francisco received gold bars valued at 39 million Swedish kroner in its Stockholm account. The gold bore the stamp of the old Caesar government of Russia, unquote. The Dollar Company agent in Stockholm applied to the American Express Company for facilities to ship the gold to the United States. American Express refused to handle the shipment. Robert Dollar, it should be noted, was a director of American International Company. Thus, AIC was linked to the first attempt at shipping gold direct to America. Simultaneously, it was reported that 3 ships had left Reval on the Baltic Sea with Soviet gold destined for the United States. The SS Gotthard loaded 216 boxes of gold under the supervision of Professor Lomonosov, now returning to the United States. The SS Caroline loaded 216 boxes of gold under the supervision of 3 Russian agents. The SS Ruliva was laden with 108 boxes of gold. Each box contained 3 poods of gold valued at 60,000 gold rubles each. This was followed by a shipment on the SS Wheeling Mold. Kuhn Loeb & Company, apparently acting on behalf of Guarantee Trust Company, then inquired of the State Department concerning the official attitude towards the receipt of Soviet gold. In a report, the department expressed concern because if acceptance was refused, then, quote, the gold would probably come back on the hands of the War Department, causing thereby direct government responsibility and increased embarrassment, unquote. The report, written by Merle Smith, in conference with Kelly and Gilbert, argues that unless the possessor has definite knowledge as to the imperfect title, it would be impossible to refuse acceptance. It was anticipated that the U.S. would be requested to melt the gold in the assay office, and it was thereupon decided to telegraph Kuhn Loeb & Company that no restrictions would be imposed on the importation of Soviet gold into the United States. The gold arrived at the New York Assay office and was deposited not by Kuhn Loeb and Company, but by the Guarantee Trust Company of New York City. Guarantee Trust then inquired of the Federal Reserve Board, which in turn inquired of the U.S. Treasury concerning acceptance and payment. The superintendent of the New York Assay office informed the Treasury that the approximately $7 million of gold had no identifying marks, and that, quote, the bars deposited have already been melted in the United States mint bars, unquote. The Treasury suggested that the Federal Reserve Board determine whether Guarantee Trust Company had acted, quote, for its own account or the account of another in presenting the gold, unquote, and particularly, quote, whether or not any transfer of credit or exchange transaction has resulted from the importation or deposit of the gold, unquote. On November 10th, 1920, Abe Bratton, a vice president of the Guarantee Trust, wrote to Assistant Secretary Gilbert of the Treasury Department complaining that Guarantee had not received from the Assay Office the usual immediate advance against deposits of, quote, yellow metal left with them for reduction, unquote. The letter states that Guarantee Trust had received satisfactory assurances that the bars were the product of melting French and Belgian coins, although it had purchased the metal in Holland. The letter requested that the Treasury expedite payment for the gold. In reply, the Treasury argued that it, quote, does not purchase gold tendered to the United States Mint or Assay offices, which is known or suspected to be of Soviet origin, unquote. And in view of known Soviet sales of gold in Holland, the gold submitted by Guarantee Trust Company was held to be, quote, doubtful case with suggestions of Soviet origin, unquote. It suggested that the Guarantee Trust Company could withdraw the gold from the Assay office at any time it wished, or could, quote, present such further evidence to the Treasury, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, or the Department of State as may be necessary to clear the gold of any suspicion of Soviet origin, unquote. There is no file record concerning final disposition of this case, but presumably the Guarantee Trust Company was paid for the shipment. Obviously, this gold deposit was to implement the mid-1920 fiscal agreement between Guarantee Trust and the Soviet government, under which the company became the Soviet agent in the United States. It was determined at a later date that Soviet gold was also being sent to the Swedish Mint. The Swedish Mint, quote, melts Russian gold, assays it, and affixes the Swedish Mint stamp at the request of Swedish banks or other Swedish subjects owing the gold, unquote. And at the same time, Olaf Aschberg, head of Svenska Economy, AB, the Soviet intermediary and affiliate of Guarantee Trust, was offering, quote, unlimited quantities of Russian gold, unquote, through Swedish banks. Excuse me. In brief, we can tie American International Corporation, the influential Professor Lomonosov, Guarantee Trust, and Olaf Aschberg, whom we've previously identified, to the first attempts to import Soviet gold into the United States. Max May of Guarantee Trust becomes director of Roscombank. Guarantee Trust's interest in Soviet Russia was renewed in 1920 in the form of a letter from Henry C. Emery, assistant manager of the Foreign Department of Guarantee Trust, to DeWitt C. Poole in the State Department. The latter was dated January 21st, 1920, just a few weeks before Alan Walker, the manager of the Foreign Department, became active in forming the virulent anti-Soviet organization, United Americans. Emery posed numerous questions about the legal basis of the Soviet government in banking in Russia and inquired whether the Soviet government was the de facto government in Russia. Quote, revolt before 1922, planned by Reds, unquote, claimed United Americans in 1920, but Guaranteed Trust had started negotiations with these same Reds and was acting as a Soviet agent in the United States in the mid-1920s. In January 1922, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover interceded with the State Department on behalf of the Guarantee Trust scheme to set up exchange relations with the, quote, new state bank at Moscow, unquote. This scheme, wrote Herbert Hoover, quote, would not be objectionable if a stipulation were made that all monies coming into their possession should be used for the purchase of civilian commodities in the United States, unquote. And after asserting that such relations appeared to be in line with general policy, Hoover added, quote, it might be advantageous to have these transactions organized in such a manner that we know that what the movement is instead of integrated operations now current, unquote. Of course, such, quote, disintegrated operations, unquote, are consistent with the operations of a free market. But this approach Herbert Hoover rejected in favor of channeling the exchange through specified and controllable sources in New York. Secretary of State Charles Hughes expressed dislike of the Hoover Guaranteed Trust scheme, which he thought could be regarded as de facto recognition of the Soviets, while the foreign credits acquired might be used to the disadvantage of the United States. A non-committal reply was sent by State to Guarantee Trust. However, Guarantee went ahead with Herbert Hoover's support, participated in formation of the first Soviet International Bank, and Max May of Guarantee Trust became head of the foreign department of the new Roscom Bank. That's pretty good. Chapter 10. J.P. Morgan gives a little help to the other side. I would not sit down to lunch with a Morgan, except possibly to learn something of his motives and attitudes. William E. Dodd, Ambassador Dodd's Diary, 1933 through 1938. So far, our story... So far, our story has revolved around a single major financial house, Guarantee Trust Company, the largest trust company in the United States and controlled by the J.P. Morgan firm. Guarantee Trust used Olaf Oshberg, the Bolshevik banker, as its intermediary in Russia before and after the revolution. Guarantee was a backer of Ludwig Martens and his Soviet Bureau, the first Soviet representatives in the United States. And in mid-1920, Guarantee was the Soviet fiscal agent in the United States. The first shipments of Soviet gold to the United States also traced back to Guarantee Trust. There's a startling reverse side to this pro-Bolshevik activity. Guarantee Trust was a founder of United Americans, a virulent anti-Soviet organization which noisily threatened Red invasion by 1922, reclaimed that 20 million of Soviet funds were on the way to fund Red Revolution, and forecast panic in the streets and mass starvation in New York City. This duplicity raises, of course, serious questions about the intentions of Guarantee Trust and its directors. dealing with the Soviets, even backing them, can be explained by apolitical greed or simply profit motive. On the other hand, spreading propaganda designed to create fear and panic, while at the same time encouraging the conditions that give rise to the fear and panic, is a considerably more serious problem. It suggests utter moral depravity. Let's first look more closely at the anti-communist United Americans. United Americans formed to fight communism. New York Times, June 21st, 1919. In 1920, the organization United Americans was founded. It was limited to citizens of the United States and planned for 5 million members, quote, whose sole purpose would be to combat the teachings of socialists, communists, IWW, Russian organizations, and radical farmers' societies, unquote. In other words, United Americans was to fight all those institutions and groups believed to be anti-capitalist. The officers of the preliminary organization established to build up United Americans were Alan Walker of the Guarantee Trust Company, Daniel Willard, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, H. Westinghouse of Westinghouse Air Brake Company, and Otto H. Kahn of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, an American international company. These Wall Streeters were backed up by assorted university presidents and Newton W. Gilbert, former governor of the Philippines. Obviously, United Americans was, at first glance, exactly the kind of organization that establishment capitalists would be expected to finance and join. Its formation should have brought no great surprise. On the other hand, as we have already seen, these financiers were also deeply involved in supporting the new Soviet regime in Russia. Although the support was behind the scenes, recorded only in government files, and not to be made public for 50 years. As part of United Americans, Walker, Willard, Westinghouse, and Kahn were playing a double game. Otto H. Kahn, a founder of the anti-communist organization, was reported by the British socialist J. H. Thomas as having his, quote, face towards the light, unquote. Kahn wrote the preface to Thomas's book. In 1924, Otto Kahn addressed the League for Industrial Democracy and professed common objectives with this activist socialist group. See page 49. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Willard's employer, was active in the development of Russia during the 1920s. Westinghouse in 1920, the year United Americans was founded, was operating a plant in Russia that had been exempted from nationalization, and the role of Guarantee Trust has already been minutely described. United Americans reveals, quote, startling disclosures, unquote, on Reds. In March 1920, the New York Times headlined an extensive detailed scare story about Red invasion of the United States within 2 years, an invasion which was to be financed by 20 million of Soviet funds, quote, obtained by the murder and robbery of the Russian nobility, unquote. United Americans had, it was revealed, made a survey of, quote, radical activities, unquote, in the United States, and had done so in its role as an organization formed to, quote, preserve the Constitution of the United States with the representative form of government and the right of individual possession which the Constitution provides, unquote. Further, the survey, it was proclaimed, had the backing of the executive board, quote, including Otto H. Kahn, Alan Walker of the Guarantee Trust Company, Daniel Willard, unquote, and others. The survey asserted that, quote, the radical leaders are confident of effecting a revolution within 2 years, that the start is to be made in New York City with a general strike, that Red leaders have predicted much bloodshed, and that the Russian Soviet government has contributed 20 million to the American radical movement, unquote. The Soviet gold shipments to Guarantee Trust in mid-1920, 540 boxes of 3 poods each, worth roughly $15 million at $20 a troy ounce, and other gold shipments through Robert Dollar and Olaf Oshberg brought the total very closely to $20 million. The information about Soviet gold for the radical movement was called, quote, thoroughly reliable, unquote. It was being, quote, being turned over to the government, unquote. The Reds, it was asserted, planned to starve New York into submission within 4 days. Quote, meanwhile, the Reds count on financial panic within the next few weeks to help their cause along. A panic would cause distress among the working men and thus render them more susceptible to revolution doctrine. Unquote. The United Americans' report grossly overstated the number of radicals in the United States, at first tossing around figures like 2 or 5 million, and then settling for precisely 3,465,000 members in 4 radical organizations. The report concluded by emphasizing the possibility of bloodshed and quoted Skaczewski, president of the International Publishing Association, otherwise the Communist Party, who boasted that the time was coming soon when the communists would destroy utterly the present form of society. Unquote. In brief, United Americans published a report without substantiating evidence, designed to scare the man in the street into panic. The significant point, of course, is that this is the same group that was responsible for protecting and subsidizing, indeed assisting, the Soviets so they could undertake these same plans. Conclusions concerning United Americans. Is this a case of the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing? Probably not. We are talking about heads of companies, eminently successful companies, at that. So United Americans was probably a ruse to divert public and official attention from the subterranean efforts being made to gain entry to the Russian market. United Americans is the only documented example known to this writer of an organization assisting the Soviet regime and also in the forefront of opposition to the Soviets. This is by no means an inconsistent course of action, and further research should be at least focused on the following aspects. A. Are there other examples of double dealing by influential groups generally known as the establishment? B. Can these examples be extended into other areas?